Welcome to another edition of Coffee Break with Paolo. I'm Paolo von Schirach, your host and the president of the Global Policy Institute, a think tank in Washington, D.C. This podcast is brought to you by Bay Atlantic University, located also in downtown Washington, D.C., just 2 blocks from the White House. This series is produced by Switch and Board in Washington, D.C. as well. Today, we're talking about U.S.-Turkey relations. It is a rather complicated subject, to put it mildly, encompassing politics, the geopolitics of the Middle East, and now procurement of important weapon systems. To discuss all this, we have with us Dr. Mark Meirowitz, Associate Professor at SUNY Maritime College and a Global Policy Institute Fellow. Mark, welcome to our podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here, Paolo.
All right, let's get right into it. We know there's a lot of stuff to cover. As I said, geopolitics, politics, this and that. And I'm sure we'll have enough time for everything. But let's jump into the topics that has been in the news in recent weeks. And that is the ruckus caused by the purchase, and now finalized on the part of the Turkish government, of an air defense system from Russia, the famed or infamous S-400. Right. Tell us what's going on. Bring us up to date.
Well, where we are right now today, and that's what I say about Turkish politics, that you have to check every day to see what's going on because the situation is very fluid, and particularly on this one. Today, the Republican senators are meeting with President Trump at the White House to talk about whether or not the president should impose sanctions on Turkey for having acquired the S-400. Okay?
Again, let's clarify to our audience, the S-400 comes from Russia.
It does.
Turkey is a member of NATO,
it
of course, just like the United States. And it is not polite, to put it mildly, to purchase major systems from your, I wouldn't call them enemy necessarily, but
adversary.
Let's say adversary. Let's say people who are not necessarily our greatest friends. And this is what caused the friction, right?
That's right.
Explain to us what's happening.
I think what happened is, look, Turkey is in a very difficult position, as you say, strategically, geopolitically. It sits in a hotbed, as a Turkish friend of mine said, we live in a tough neighborhood. It's the toughest neighborhood. And it has many, many adversaries, to use the word we spoke about before. And Turkey was looking for a sufficient defense system that it could use to protect itself. And at a point in time, it was in discussions with the United States about acquiring our Patriots. I think there were some Patriot batteries in Turkey, and some were pulled out. I think some still remain. But the idea was to go heavily into the Patriots. And then there's a question of what occurred. But at the end of the day, they didn't get the Patriots. And so, from the Turkish point of view, they were looking for a system, and Russia offered the S-400 system.
Just to explain to everybody that is not particularly familiar with, military hardware, this is an air defense system.
Yes.
These are missiles based on land aimed at shooting down flying objects.
That's
okay,
right.
Let's put it, just so that everybody understands. So why is it that it's such a big deal from an American viewpoint that Turkey decided to buy a Russian air defense system as opposed to an American or British or French or whatever?
You said before that Turkey is a member of NATO, so going and doing deals with Russia is a problem because, first of all, this equipment is not interoperable with NATO, and Turkey had a similar situation with China some years ago where it wanted to buy some ordnance from CPMIEC, a Chinese company. They dropped that because of pressure that this was not interoperable with NATO. What is the problem with the S-400 and how is it pointedly a problem is because how it interacts with the F-35 stealth fighter, which is a highly sophisticated stealth fighter. And the problem with it is that, besides the fact the S-400 has tremendous range and can shoot down the F-35, it is also it's a smart technology. I'm not an engineer, but apparently if you put the F-35 together with the S-400 can, and there would also be Russian technicians on the spot as well, the equipment can understand clearly the abilities and inabilities of the F-35, which is highly secret and classified.
Absolutely.
And that is what the United States was fearful of if you pair them together. And at the end of the day, it's kind of what the defense secretary said, but also the bipartisan members of Congress. You can't have an S-400 and F-35 combination.
Again,
you can't have them both.
Let's explain this to those who are not totally familiar with this. The F-35 is an advanced tactical fighter produced by the United States,
That's right.
as it were, in conjunction, in co-production with some other countries, and indeed Turkey was one of them. We'll determine that. For some parts and components, and Turkey was in for buying about 100 of them.
That's right.
That's a lot of fighters, since they're quite expensive. In fact, it's the most expensive weapon system in history, I believe. And, all the purchases produced by Lockheed Martin, a major American defense contractor. And so the idea that you would have in the same place, in the same theater, on the same side, this advanced tactical fighter, which is a stealth fighter, which has a special signature about, how it evades radar, how it evades detection, et cetera, and the most advanced air defense system, which is basically designed to shoot down the F-35 or any other NATO aircraft, is really a big deal. And so the United States, both the administration and the Congress and NATO as well, even though as we will cover in a moment, NATO has had more nuanced positions, at least on the political side. So the answer has been, okay, if you guys go ahead with the S-400, no F-35. So give us what's the latest on this?
So the so-called Solomonic solution. I want to make one point before we get to the solution, and that is, when Turkey takes technology like the F-35, it always wants technology transfer. It wants to be in the game, okay? And the United States has been resistant. And furthermore, the Russians have also promised technology transfer, but we're not sure that if Turkey does a deal with Russia, they're going to get that. They want to be able to be in the game and learn the technology. That was an issue. But where we are right now is that the Defense Department has basically not just suspended, but terminated Turkey from the F-35 program, and the Turkish pilots who have been here training in the United States are apparently going to be asked to leave the country on or about July 31st. Now, this is quite a big, significant point. I mean, there's big money involved. Lots of money was spent on this, and Turkey was also going to produce many of these parts. So there are a lot of high stakes in this. But again, when President Trump evaluated this issue and a number of his statements in the Oval Office, when this came up, he was asked about this, let's say, kerfuffle, a problem or a significant issue, and he said that the problem really is, why does Turkey why did it take the S-400s? It's because it couldn't get the Patriots. And the reason it couldn't get the Patriots is squarely because of President Obama. President Obama is at fault. Turkey is our friend, okay? That was his idea. But I think I was going to go back to my quasi-Solomonic solution. Maybe it isn't, but if the problem is the pairing of the S-400, smart technology, and its ability to understand, and again, I'm not an engineer, but to understand the capabilities of the F-35, which is highly classified, highly secret, if that's the issue, by then terminating Turkey from the F-35, which causes a world of hurt to Turkey and also to the American companies and to the people who work on it and all of that. Nevertheless, by separating that, and you have the S-400 on its own, which we can talk about, what does that mean? But the F-35 is not in the mix. So maybe, again, we're trying to psychoanalyze Trump and figure out if he has a policy. Maybe the solution that he thought about was, I pull out the F-35 so then the two systems are not together, and then we figure out what to do, or what will Turkey do with the S-400s. That's what I think, but can't be sure. But I think it's, again, it's, quote, helpful, but in a very, very, what I'm going to quote Trump, he's a mess. He said it's a mess. It is a mess for the reason that you mentioned, in that Turkey is a NATO ally. Look, Russia is clearly an adversary. I mean, there's no question about it. And Russia has pushed into NATO and in terms of Crimea, Ukraine, and also selling this type of ordnance to other countries like India, Saudi Arabia, Azerbaijan. So this is at the pivot point of Russia's, I would say, interference and diminution of the influence of NATO. We can talk about the influence of NATO and how NATO reacted to this, which is pretty maybe expected or maybe surprising on the one hand. So at the end of the day, the question is, will Turkey be left alone with the S-400? Will it have sanctions? And what will the effect be at the end of the day?
Again, yes,
That's
let's add this other wrinkle,
Yeah.
which is kind of technical. Technically speaking, Turkey having bought this system, which is now it's a done deal. They've already taken delivery, essentially. So I don't think there's any way of walking this back and say, oh, sorry, we made a mistake. Amazon, can you?
Well, I think
can we
they
send
took
it back to you?
17 or more deliveries, but I don't believe they have them all. I'm not sure.
No, I'm saying, but
But
they
they're
started.
taking delivery, sure.
This is
of
taking
course.
delivery.
The
It's not-
Amazon packages are coming on. They're coming on a regular basis.
It's coming.
Right,
You know.
exactly.
So in other words, I don't think they can say, "Sorry, we made a mistake. We
Right.
don't like the color.
Right.
It's really not my size, and can you take it back
Precisely,
and give me my money?"
precisely.
That's $2.5 billion. I think
Exactly.
the value of the sale. So here's the thing: there is a law on the books that would. I guess I don't know if force is the exact word, but certainly would guide the U.S. president, the executive, to enact sanctions on the country that does pretty much what Turkey has done. There is some wiggle room because there's a laundry list of sanctions, but not exactly saying which ones the executive branch has to select, and there is no specific timeline. So, in other words, the president so far, and please tell us the latest, has said, well, I haven't made up my mind about sanctions, and I'll let you know. Which means I'll do it, I won't do it, I won't do anything, I'll postpone it, I'll table it, I'll do a little, or I'll do nothing. You know, whatever his whims can be, and then what the Congress will try to do to force his hand, etc. How, in other words, tell us, as a scholar, as a student of Turkey and U.S., how do you think this part is going? Are there going to be sanctions?
Well, I mean, a prediction in politics is sort
I
of,
know,
astrology. But
yes.
here's the thing. When Trump signed this CAATSA law, C-A-A-T-S-A, the Countering Adversaries Law, and by the way, that law was directed against Russia. It's directed Iran
this
and
is
North Korea. It's not directed. It wasn't intended for NATO allies, but President Trump signed the law, but he wrote a signing statement, which is quite prevalent. The presidents do it. And in that signing statement, Trump said, I think this law unfairly or unlawfully, I think that was the word, limits my discretion as the executive to make deals. So what you see there is sort of an insight into how Trump views this law. I mean, he likes to make deals. He doesn't want to have laws that tell him he must do A, B, or C. Now, you're correct. There's a menu of 12 sanctions. He's supposed to select 5, but he has an option of picking perhaps sanctions. If he does pick sanctions to impose, he can either impose them now or impose them maybe to punt them. I think it's 6 months at a time. It isn't altogether clear, but he could pick some milder sanctions. Now, the point of the matter is, it is Trump, so Trump will follow the law, or he could say, this is not for a NATO ally. So then the point that you raise about the Congress, I would say that's why he's got the Republican senators over to the White House to take their pulse on it, because honestly, he didn't invite the Democrats. Because the Democrats in Congress, particularly in the House, are fixated on impeachment and Mueller and subpoenas.
Other things. Okay.
So they're focusing in a contentious fashion with him. So maybe they'll be contentious about this too.
All right.
I wanted to make one last point.
Sure.
I think it's very important. The statements on this issue from the House Foreign Affairs Committee and Senate Foreign Relations Committee have been bipartisan. Bipartisan. The chair and the ranking member of both of those committees. I think that's very important. And what was the tenor of those statements? You can't have the F-35 and the S-400 together. That's exactly what they said. Now, that's been separated. So the question is, I think, A, what does Turkey do with the S-400s? And B, what's the reaction of the Congress if Trump does little or nothing in response? These are, in some respect, imponderables, but you must connect that. I must connect it to domestic politics. It's extremely important because let's suppose he punts it 6 months, hypothetically, right? He punts it down the road, and now we're down the road and we're in the literal runway to the 2020 election. And at that point, the country is fixated and focused on Trump's election and all of that. And that is what the American people focus on. They're not in, I mean, truthfully, it's an important issue we're talking about. Yes, it's geopolitical, but the average American isn't interested in it. It isn't. It's not a focus of getting reelected as president, whether Trump sanctions Turkey or doesn't sanction Turkey. What he wants is a decision that is harmless. And that's why he's talking to Republicans.
So here there's another wrinkle, which again is probably lost on the majority of the voters that, as you correctly pointed out, will be interested in completely different issues, whether it's health care or
jobs,
or
housing,
whatever. Not Turkey, S-400, that people don't quite understand what they are.
Exactly.
And even if we go a little further, there is another problem, which is an alliance problem, that, again, the Secretary General of NATO said, well, this is kind of an issue. He said, in principle, any member can buy their stuff, their hardware, wherever they please. It's a free world.
Yes.
On the other hand, you got to be careful where that's not exactly that it's equal and indifferent. And so that was the issue of the incompatibility with the F-35, which potentially now has gone away. However, there is also the issue of the S-400, which has to be, for NATO air defenses to work together seamlessly, has to be connected with the entire network of NATO-wide air defense systems. Exactly. And by definition, this cannot be connected. Of course, the Turks have said, oh, don't worry about that because this will be a standalone thing, will not be connected, etc. In fact, I've heard rumors saying, really, what the President Erdogan, his major concern was in the light of the failed coup, that he wants to use the system against his own Air Force. That was really a wild thing. I said, come again? But I've heard this from some, in other words, people saying, there is a concern that's precisely the reason why he got a system that would shoot down NATO airplanes. The F-16s, after all, were those that attacked the Turkish parliament at the time of the failed. Again, this is really wild stuff. I won't get into it. I have no idea if it lends any credibility. But the idea that we've heard many times from Turkish officials, leaving aside all these rumors, unsubstantiated. Let me be clear. There's no verification or validation of any of this. Is that this would be kind of a standalone system that would do its own thing, and it would not be integrated with the network of NATO air defense systems, and therefore it would not jeopardize the effectiveness of that. Again, I am not, like you, an engineer, an aerospace engineer, or anything. I don't know how that really works, and if NATO can kind of say, okay, well, on second thought, is not so bad, let it be. Because also there is the issue of precedent. Because the moment in which you say it's okay to buy weapons from anybody, well, then you say, okay, if it's okay for Turkey, why is it not okay for the Czech Republic or Romania or
India, Saudi Arabia?
No, but India, no, I'm talking members of NATO.
Yes, I got you.
I'm talking members of NATO.
Yeah.
So anyway, but let's assume with some optimism that we've kind of put this thing to bed, that this is kind of not on the front burner. Okay, other things that are on the front burner are the extradition of Fethullah Gulen.
Well, before you get to that, I just wanted to add one or two points, if I could, to what you mentioned. So first of all, I think that Turkey had proposed that they could do an engineering or a technical fix to this, as you said. And they wanted to put together, I think, a joint technical committee to work out these issues. And I don't think the United States was very receptive to that. And that was kind of Turkey's position. We wanted to put together a proposal to work this out, to make sure the S-400 and the F-35 would interact with each other in appropriate fashion. It would be controlled. So that was not, the United States didn't want to go down that route. And then we didn't really talk much about the Patriots. Of course, Defense Minister Hulusi Akar was quoted recently as saying, we're thinking about the Patriots. So I don't know if somewhere in the pantheon of this, there is a solution to do something about the Patriots, maybe box up the S-400s. I don't know the answer to that. But I think that the technical fix was not an option. Now, about NATO, I just want to say something before we get to the next point about that. The statement about the Secretary General of NATO was kind of very indicative of the level of kind of calm rhetoric on this issue. One might have expected from a NATO Secretary General more excitation and more excitement about this, what this is going on, Russian technicians coming, S-400, and his statement was sort of like, Turkey is more than the F-35 and the S-400. Turkey is a NATO ally, and when the interviewer said to Stoltenberg, well, is Turkey going to remain in NATO? And he goes, that's not a question. I'm not even going there, right? In other words, his reaction was very low-key. And I think also Trump's reaction, his rhetoric, was very low-key. Erdogan's my friend, Turkey's our friend, Obama's at fault. I'm not saying Obama's at fault or not, but the answer to the question puts the level of discussion on a kind of an interaction. So what I'm trying to get at about NATO, even NATO's reaction to the Russian invasion of Crimea was kind of astonishing. I mean, you would have thought they were talking about how you're organizing your closet. I mean, they say, oh, the Russians invaded Crimea, and gee, that's not a good thing. That's NATO. So, in other words, where we are is, I think we're kind of at a crossroads, really. S-400 is there, F-35 is terminated, and I think the more important question is what happens next? What happens next? Does Russia now take the S-500? Do they take the Su-37 fighter? They don't have the F-35. There is where the key contention will come into place, and there would be possible pushback and backlash. I'm not talking about CATSA. CATSA could come into play. There is where you end up with the worry, which I think a number of the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, a number of the commentators have said, let's not provoke a split, a break with Turkey because we need Turkey, Turkey's strategic ally. These countries need each other. Turkey is a key position in the region. So again, we're at a crossroads. So a lot of it depends on what the next steps are going to be. If the next steps are going to be continuing in this vein, well, then that becomes a problem. But maybe there's a fix. I mentioned India and Saudi Arabia only because it looks like Russia, in its mischievous behavior and malevolent behavior, is continuing to push forward to try to interrupt and interfere with NATO. So it's a bigger subject than Turkey that we need to address here, I think.
I mean, the fact that Russia is pushing its own weapons exports, it doesn't surprise me. That's the only thing they've got. Exactly. So, it seems to me the S-400 is a very good system. In fact, it has more capabilities than the Patriot, such as if you do a side-by-side comparison. But in any event, just one footnote on this is that there's a significant distinction between the public utterances of the Secretary General of NATO and of SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander, who said absolutely no way that we can accept the S-400 in the NATO air defense system. That's what he said. Whether that is, after all, he's a general, he's not a political leader. So who makes decisions, who ultimately prevails, I have no idea. But again, let's see if this issue is, again, not on the front burner anymore. But there's plenty.
If I could do another PS, I'm sorry, because it's important. What about Turkey's relations with Russia? And I think it's important to keep in mind that it sources a large percentage of its energy resources from Russia.
Yes.
And it needs to work a fix with Russia in Syria. I mean, Russia is
We'll get
key.
to that. Hold on.
All I'm trying to get at,
please. We'll get to that.
I won't go any further, but I did want to say that when you said before this was complex, It
Yes.
is
Well-
multifaceted, so you can't just look at the F-35 and the S-400. You've got to look at the whole
Yes.
context.
Okay.
And
let's-
you agree with me on that?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Let's one thing at a time.
perfect.
Okay.
You got it.
Thank you.
Sure.
So let's talk about Fethullah Gulen. Explain to those who don't know, and probably which is the majority of our listeners, what's going on. What is the issue of Fethullah? Who is Fethullah Gulen? Who, by the way, for the record, lives in the United States. Why is he such a dark figure in Turkish politics from a Turkish perspective?
Right.
The allegation of he being the mastermind of the failed coup of 2016,
Yeah.
and the repression that followed the attempted coup, and what's the state of play right now, considering that the Turkish government has officially asked for the extradition of this gentleman, who is, at least his official occupation, is to be a sort of a spiritual man, a teacher, a religious person, not involved in politics, not involved in business, at least officially, right? So what's the situation? Where are we going on this? And based on what you know and what you can surmise, is he going to be extradited? Do you
Well,
think?
we're back again with predictions, and so impossible to know the answer to that. Let's just look a little bit back to the period that you talked about. And I think that will be our next podcast, will be this, because we need a long time to
Yeah.
talk about. It's highly complex and goes really to the history of Turkey and its various components and interests. But the coup occurred in 2016 in the summer, and that was still, Obama was still in power, and the Turkish government said it's Gulen who's responsible, and we can prove it. And President Obama, we keep mentioning him, he punted it because he went out of office, he didn't do anything about it, and went into Trump's lap, okay? Now, the extradition treaty between Turkey and the United States has essentially two components, which are the State Department and the Justice Department. That is a political aspect and a legal aspect. The Turkish position is that they presented documentation to show that Gulen was behind the coup, which you just said before. This is in the courts, and I have no knowledge at all of what was presented or what those judicial proceedings are. But it would appear that whatever was presented was not, for whatever reason, acceptable. But I don't know what was presented. I have no idea. I have no knowledge at all. So the answer to your point is, where do we stand now? We stand that there is no extradition. From the United States, there is no extradition, and that is under a treaty. And so again, what it is it's the State Department also. And the State Department is involved in diplomacy with Turkey, and so the diplomacy with Turkey is, again, you said complex, multifaceted, and one aspect of it. And again, but the judicial part of it, I think, is also important, because I have to have a certain amount that has to go through the courts.
Yes.
So it hasn't proceeded to a point under the American judicial system where it is where a decision has been made to extradite him, and that's about it.
Yeah, to my knowledge, again, obviously, since we have our own standard of evidence, which is probable cause, and according to what we've heard so far, I don't think the issue has been adjudicated, to my knowledge, yet. It's pending. But there seems to be doubt as to whether the Turkish government, notwithstanding the fact that they worked on this for years now, to produce evidence
Well, we
that
don't,
they
we don't
have.
know that we don't know that, because when you say probable cause, okay, so first of all, guilt in a criminal proceeding is beyond a probable cause, right? But this is not a criminal proceeding.
No,
this
this
is
is
an
about-
extradition under a treaty. So in other words, the question is really highly political, I believe. Extraditing someone, we've seen this with Assange, with all these big international figures. It's not just about what the case is about. The case is, there's no criminal case in the United States per se. The question is the procedures under the administration. Justice and state are under the executive branch. And whatever the Turkish government has produced, and I don't know what they produced, apparently hasn't done the trick, but I just don't know. I have no knowledge of what they produced.
No, but let's be clear.
Yeah,
The extradition is not adjudicated by the Department of Justice. It's adjudicated by a court, which is outside. It's a federal court outside
No,
the
I
jurisdiction.
understand that point, but I meant the justice track and the
Yes.
diplomatic track.
Anyway.
And those tracks, again, when you talk about the evidence, I honestly don't know, I wouldn't opine on what the standard of evidence has to be in order to be able to have an extradition.
Has to be an American standard of evidence.
I looked at the treaty a while ago, I don't recollect. I know the two tracks, and there are, by the way, I want to make another point too about that treaty, if I recollect correctly, there are a number of tiers of appeal in that treaty. So in other words, a decision is made, and then it can be appealed, and then it can be appealed. So there's a complicated, let us say, administrative procedural aspect to it also, which makes it not a slam dunk. Let's put it this way. The Turks basically want a slam dunk. It hasn't happened, and that's about all I think
Well,
I'm
but
gonna
then,
say
of
about
course, we know that precisely because of this disagreement, that this certainly has soured relations, because clearly Turkey was expecting or hoping to have, quote, some kind of more cooperation and a sense on the part of the United States that they would say, well, of course, this is damning evidence. Of course, this guy is guilty. We agree with you. Off he goes, from Pennsylvania, where he resides. That is Mr. Fethullah Gulen. And we'll ship it back to you, and you put him on trial, do whatever you see fit. Well, this hasn't happened, and it's been now 3 years, and so since the coup at least.
That's right.
Even though they tried other judicial actions earlier, prior to the coup, which failed. So anyway, so that's another, let's say, another irritant, unresolved irritant in the bilateral relationship. Let's talk about another one, which is kind of an old one, but still not going away, and that's the Kurds, all right? So to bring everybody up to speed, we know that at the time of the establishment of the caliphate of ISIL or Daesh, whatever the preferred acronym or denomination is, this group of radical Islamists controlled a significant portion of northeastern Syria and northern Iraq. And this led to a slow, really, really slow process of creating a US-led international coalition. This was back under President Obama started, to try to, push back and defeat this threat. It took a very, very long time, but it sort of succeeded. But in the middle of doing all this, this is just background, that the United States saw it fit to rely on the support of Kurdish forces in northern Syria as the people who, on the ground, would do sort of the heavy lifting and the fighting against the caliphate. And of course, this didn't sit well with Ankara at all, because Ankara has been claiming all along that the people that the United States chose as allies, YPG, whatever the
YPG and PYD.
And PYD, whatever the acronyms are essentially the same thing as the PKK, which is an outlawed and internationally recognized terrorist organization that has been unfortunately operating within Turkey for many, many years, and that Turkey has been fighting, and with the acknowledgement of the international community, including the United States, that this is really a terror organization. But the Turks say, wait a minute, you recognize the PKK as terrorists, and yet you work with their cousins, or across the border in Syria, who are also terrorists. There's no difference between the two. And the United States has been saying, well, no, not exactly, maybe a little, but not too much. And after all, these people have done such a good job working for us, etc. But now, especially since really the heavy fighting against ISIL has stopped, then the Turks say, you're still supporting these guys? This is going to come back to bite you. And in the meantime, again, this is another significant irritant in the bilateral relationship. Where is this going?
Well,
based on your,
why don't we just look at the present of what's really going on? It shows you the, I would say, schizophrenia or bifurcation of U.S. policy, right? You have Jim Jeffrey, who's the special envoy for Syria, going to Turkey to negotiate with the foreign minister and President Erdogan about policy. And then you have the CENTCOM commanders on the field, photos of them those CENTCOM officers meeting with the Kurdish officers of the YPG. And so the Turks are saying, well, what's going on here? Well, this bifurcation is a tremendous, tremendous problem. As you say, our own Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, said that the YPG, PYD, are in fact affiliated with the PKK, which is on the terrorist list of the State Department and Interpol and everybody else. And it's kind of a no-brainer from the point of view of the Turks, but they say, wait a minute, but then why are you having this interaction with them? The reason was a kerfuffle because one of the American commanders was wearing a patch on his uniform from the YPG. You know, they work together to fight ISIS or Daesh. This is a big problem. And related to it kind of comes back to what we talked about President Trump, because Trump told President Erdogan, oh, I'm going to withdraw American forces. I'm going to fix this problem. I'm not going to do that anymore. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. Yet, we see that the official envoy is going to Ankara to meet with the government on issues, and then you have CENTCOM commanders in the field on their own doing this. So it's very, and you mentioned before that one of the military officers had a different opinion than the chief, the administration. These things happen, but this would indicate to me a lack of control and managerial skills in terms of the president because of the confusion or, let's say, disorganization in the executive branch on many levels where they cannot control the issue in Syria. The one other thing about the Kurds in Syria, it's very important to understand that there is no monolithic Kurdish group. The Kurdish group is divided up. You have in Iraq and Kurdistan, you have Barzanis and Talibanis. In Syria, you have another group affiliated with PKK or Marxists. All kinds of, and of course in Turkey itself, there are 15 million Kurds. It's highly complex, and they're not just one group, one homogeneous group. So there's a lot of misunderstanding. Turkey believes that this issue is existential for them because they do not want the Kurds to create, in effect, a contiguous state on their border, and they are in frustration about the fact that, hey, your own Director of National Intelligence told you that these groups are affiliated with the PKK, yet you continue to support them. The answer is, I think, maybe not an answer, that the chaos and confusion in Syria has created kind of a short-term need to make these alliances. And Trump didn't really back up what he said. And that is the problem when the Turks deal with Trump. They say, well, wait a minute, he said that, but then he didn't do it. So maybe he said something about the S-400 and F-35, and he didn't do that. So, you know, there's a credibility gap here of great significance.
Taking all this into account, and I'm sure you're absolutely right in terms of the confusion and the contradictory messages, is America going to leave northeastern Syria, and is it going to abandon, maybe not today, but maybe tomorrow, its Kurdish allies, based on what you can surmise?
Well, again, it depends, my lawyer part is depends who you ask. And if you ask the CENTCOM commanders on the field, they're not going to be abandoning their Kurdish allies.
I'm talking about the executive decision.
I think
Ultimately,
it's the
commander-in-chief.
for Trump is withdrawal of troops. He talks about this all the time. I'm going to close up Afghanistan and withdraw troops. I'm going to withdraw troops.
Yeah, but he hasn't done it.
Make deals. But he hasn't done it.
None of it.
So there's a practical matter. More or less, I think you have some homeostasis and equilibrium, and that remains the way it is. The situation in Syria also, and it kind of goes back to what we talked about before, also hinges on Russia, because Russia is in Syria, and Russia has its interest in Syria, and particularly the issue in Idlib, which we didn't really talk about. So there are a number of factors that militate against a U.S. withdrawal at the present time. So long as these issues are festering, I mean, I wouldn't think the United States would be withdrawing its troops.
Okay.
And allowing Turkey. You see, what would happen is if America withdrew its troops, you would then have the vacuum. Again, this is maybe how America is thinking, and then the Turks would want to come in and take over the region from these Kurdish elements. And the only thing standing between that, right, and that Turkish action are the American troops. So nature abhors a vacuum. So I don't see the United States creating a vacuum because, once again, I don't think Trump wants a further disaster and crisis in Syria. Syria is bad enough as it is. Russia's influence in Syria is bad enough as it is. So I don't think he's going to exacerbate it and maybe leave that in place. The fact that the CENTCOM commanders have that much discretion in the field is because they work with these groups and they are allied with them. And I don't see Trump giving the kibosh on that. Maybe yes, maybe no. Look, if you ever listen to Trump, he really supports the military. He's always talking about the military and the need for more support of the military. So I don't see him, I don't see him withdrawing the troops. I don't see it, but, anything is possible.
So, but then, exactly, nobody really knows. It's a fluid situation, and you correctly pointed out to the different facets. But the reality is that to the extent that American troops stay in northeastern Syria and that they maintain some kind of a cover protecting the YPG Kurds to the chagrin of Ankara, this is another element of friction. We already got at least 3, right? We talked about S-400s, F-35, NATO, this and that, extensively. Now, then we talked about Fethullah Gulen, another irritant that is still resolved. Now we have American support for people that Turkey labels as terrorists, and that's another unresolved matter. So let's try to see something else. Is there a bright side here? In other words, yes, you said at the beginning, and I think probably most common sense minded people would say, yes, Turkey is a very important country. It's a traditional ally. It's a major power in a critical region. We should try to do our best to salvage, this relationship and mitigate whatever problems there are, and try to look at the bright side, if you wish, and see whether the things that binds us together, which is, I think, I couldn't agree more in principle. I'm sure you do too. But under the circumstances, what's the good stuff that one can say, okay, let's leave aside all the bad things for the moment. Maybe we'll solve them later.
Right.
Let's build on the good. What would that be in your own reading? What could we do to make things better?
Well, okay. So I think a couple of things. First reaction is we need to fix what's going on right now because we don't want that to get worse, okay? That is always a possibility because then I'd love to focus on the bright side, but I'm also worried about the other side, which is that this really goes south and then we have a real confrontation, and then the United States puts sanctions, and then Turkey puts sanctions back. And then we're in the situation the United States was with Turkey after Cyprus in 1974, where in effect Turkey said you cannot use our bases, and that becomes a really bad problem. So what we need to do is stabilize the situation and fix it. I think there's a bright side in terms of Trump's personal relationship with Erdogan. I think that is a bright point, because you notice that his way of negotiating with leaders is, it's kind of, he does deals, all right? Now, you may think that maybe doing real estate deals... He wants to do deals.
Yes, he would like to do deals. I haven't seen any deals yet.
Well, he doesn't, but
there is no deal.
In the meantime...
There is no deal with North Korea. There's no deal with China. There's no deal
with
South Korea. There's no deal with Japan. There's no deal with the European Union. There's a semi-deal with Mexico and Canada, which hasn't been ratified.
That's right.
But at least that's a deal. That's signed, not delivered, but signed.
Well, making deals is the process of making deals.
Yes.
It's the art of the deal.
Yes.
So maybe if you looked at North Korea and you said, well, they are not shooting off missiles right now, that might be a plus, and some might think that's beneficial.
Okay.
Or that they crossed
Anyway,
the DMZ. But the bottom line is that first step is making sure it doesn't get worse. Second point is the personal relationship, very, very important, and I think it is a bright point, because the alternative would be, kind of where we were with the Soviet Union, where we had, leaders who literally hated each other, mortally hated each other. I don't think we have that. So that's important. Now, the bright side is, and I would say this, you have to have a historical and long-range view of where the United States has been with Turkey. And I think that's, to me, maybe not an immediate bright side. I can't predict the future. But if you look back, you have to look back and see what did the United States do with Turkey? The Truman Doctrine, the Montreux Agreement, and Turkey's many, many battles with Russia. You know, the long arm of history is right there. So that relationship between Turkey and the West, and Turkey, NATO, Turkey, U.S., etc., has been very beneficial for stability of Turkey in the region. It's got some big challenges. We didn't talk about the economy in Turkey. That's a big challenge, and how all of these developments can affect that. That's very problematic. Lots of problems. We didn't talk about the Eastern Mediterranean. There, Turkey also has a conflict situation as well with Greece and the U.S. So we've had these problems in the past. We've had these glitches, and we've gotten over them. The question is, and that would be a bright side for me, if we can work out a way to get out of this and fix the current difficult situation without exacerbating it and making it become worse. That would be very bright in my.
Okay,
it's not a win-win. But it's better than going down the slippery slope of sanctions and counter-sanctions and sanctions and backlash. There we could get stuck like we were stuck for a number of years until President Carter unstuck it, and we were able to come back with Turkey because we had an embargo on Turkey, and we don't want to go that. We can't go that route. It isn't efficacious for world stability to go that route, and nor is it efficacious for Turkey to have counter-sanctions.
Yeah. Okay, let me put it from a different perspective.
Yes.
Until the end of the Cold War, that is the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990, 1991, there was this sort of magic glue that kept this whole thing together, which was, when all is said and done, we still have a common enemy, and that is the Soviet Union. And that, kind of a sobering moment, that even in the worst of heated arguments and controversies, you could say, well, wait a minute, we still have something more that binds us together as opposed to what may divide us at any given point. Well, that glue is gone, really gone, because the Soviet Union is no longer. That level of threat represented by the Soviet Union has disappeared. You can say, well, wait, not so fast, because Russia is still, a dangerous customer in the neighborhood, what have you. But for all practical purposes, that logic, you mentioned the Truman Doctrine and other things, that's way, way gone. It doesn't, it's historically interesting and relevant, but not, in the actuality at the moment is like it never happened, and it doesn't mean anything in the present world. And all the people who are active participants in the bilateral relationship at the time, they're all dead, God bless them. So here we are in a different environment, post-Cold War environment, in which people make different kinds of determination, rightly or wrongly. I am still of the opinion, and I think we agree on this, that it would be a tremendous mistake to do anything that would further alienate Turkey from the West, from the US or Europe or whatever, or NATO, etc. And so at the very least, as you said, let's not make things worse, try to ameliorate this controversial points. And I'm not quite sure how this is done, because I thought that there were some real hopes when, as you mentioned, President Trump said, okay, we're out of Syria, and then we're not. This was back at the beginning of the year. He said, we're out, we're done, we're finished. And everybody was say, okay, we're packing, guys, we're going, and then we're not going, and we're still there. And maybe it's some reduced numbers, but we're still there. So all these things, and there's no point repeating the litany. So let's see, as President Trump likes to say, let's see what happens, right?
Well, but I think Russia, when you say this is all history, but I think it's really not. Look, Russia is not, an ideological communist country that's looking to control the world. It's obviously clearly not the Soviet Union, but the Russia element of Russia is still there. And And maybe
Well, but
they
Turkey
try-
likes it at the moment.
Well, I don't know that they like it because they're dependent. We talked about this a little bit before. Dependent on energy, worried about Syria, worried about Idlib basically falling apart and more refugees coming in. Russia has kind of a control. It's sitting like the Wizard of Oz at the control center. And it's controlling a lot of what goes on, and Turkey is dependent on that. So Turkey doesn't have full options. And back to the Straits, because I've been looking back at Montreux and looking at what happened. Look, Russia always wanted to have the ability to expand into Mediterranean. It even pressured Turkey, if you recall, which is how the Montreux Convention came about. Russia expansion is all part of Russian history, but it's also contemporary. Look at their activities today, right? Interference in elections, invasions. They've really pushed the envelope. They are a malevolent power in the world. So therefore, maybe when Turkey looks at them, maybe they don't see that. And I think that, or maybe they do see it. But you really have to look at the context and say, now, wake up now, just remember what occurred. I'm not saying that, America gets extra brownie points for the Truman Doctrine, but the threats that occurred, maybe they were different quality threats, different types of threats, but Russia is still Russia. Russia is still expansionist. Russia is still a dangerous power. So therefore, I think it behooves the West to bring this point home to its NATO ally, Turkey, and say to Turkey, wake up and smell smell something, the vodka, I don't know what. But the point is, you better be aware that you're in a very difficult situation here. And maybe there's a way that the parties can extricate themselves, as I said before going down a road that will be irreversible, which would be cataclysmic and catastrophic. And we don't want to be in that situation. Russia's intentions and activities are plain to see. But of course, there's a balancing test, right? We said India, Saudi Arabia, we said all these countries that are maybe taking this ordinance. The United States has to kind of evaluate, what does that all mean? Does that mean that every country that takes ordinance from, Russia will get a sanction and all this? I mean, it's really a pivotal point for American policy. But again, it takes place in the context of what Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. Please watch Trump and what he emphasizes and what he does to get re-elected. I think even on Iran, right? He wants to have a dialogue. North Korea wants to have a dialogue. I agree with you, Paolo. We didn't see any signed deals with anybody, okay? But we also saw the idea, which I think even the New York Times commended Trump, having a dialogue in and of itself has validity with powers, with countries like Iran and North Korea. That has validity. So all I'm trying to say is that the situation there's a learning opportunity from what occurred. That doesn't mean you have to be stuck in history. But I think Turkey and America should be looking back at the history together and saying, we've been there for you, and we're there for you now, and you're our NATO ally, and we just don't want you to go down a road that would be damaging or to your interests. As we see them. That doesn't mean we see them the same way as Turkey sees its own interests. Obviously not. But the way America sees its interests, I think it behooves America to communicate. This point is what they're doing.
I would suspect that exactly, maybe not word for word, but pretty much the gist of the spirit of what you said is being conveyed probably on a daily basis by our diplomats and other powers that be in whatever negotiations are going on all these fronts on a daily basis. As we're moving along, you mentioned the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yes.
And I think it's important to mention that too, because this is another everything here is complicated, but this is another complicated issue. In this one, the United States is really not on the first, on the front line.
That's right.
Because we are really talking about the how can I say, undefined, or at least undecided as yet status of the island of Cyprus, which under an agreement which took place after its independence from Britain was supposed to be bicommunal, because of its history, mostly Greek in the south, mostly Turkish or entirely Turkish in the north.
Right.
So then things happen, and we're not going to rehash all the...
That'll be another podcast.
That would be too
Right.
too complicated to
Right.
do it in this sitting. But let suffice to say, back in 1974,
Yes.
Turkey feeling that having the perception that the safety of the Turkish community
Yes.
was in jeopardy because there was some kind of a coup and a movement to reunify or unify Cyprus to Greece, and that the Turks would have been, really an endangered species almost, then invaded northern Turkey, took a piece of it. Anyway, so since then, there have been essentially two states. One, a Greek Cypriot state, which has the recognition of everybody, international community, UN, blah, 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 member of the European Union, and then a northern, Turkish
Republic of Northern Cyprus.
Yes, which only Turkey, to my knowledge, recognizes
That's right.
all over the world. And and that's the bad story. The good story is that there have been several attempts over the years to negotiate
Most recently in Switzerland, I
Yes.
think it was this year or last year.
So
Yeah.
that the two communities
Yeah.
trying to figure out a way to resolve this impasse. And there, of course, as always in these matters, there is, believe it or not, refugees and divisions of property
Of
and
course.
land,
Complex.
who
Yeah.
gets what, and
Exactly.
all these things, compensation, complicated stuff. But again, something that politically, diplomatically can be
Yes.
at least addressed. So the good news is there hasn't been any fighting or anything for decades. But here now we have another wrinkle, which is energy.
Yes.
And this gets complicated because it really depends on what your perspective is. Is Cyprus one place, or is really two places?
Well,
The position
yeah.
the position of the Greek Cypriots is that all the concessions that they have awarded for the search of hydrocarbons,
Yes.
mostly natural gas, in what they claim to be their territorial waters and their exclusive economic zone. It's their privilege because they are a sovereign state and they have, jurisdiction on determining what they allocate and to whom, and
Yeah,
et cetera, et cetera. And Turkey said, wait, no, can't do that because Cyprus is one island, and whatever you find, we want a piece of it. And so that's one aspect. And then most recently, whatever other details there are, Turkey sent its own, search vessels, so to speak.
The Barbaros Pasha.
Yeah, in order to look
That's
for
right. That's
to
right.
do exploration, and at that point, Cyprus, being a member of the European Union,
That's
said,
right.
"Help, Brussels, help me! These guys are here. They're trespassers, and they're coming to
That's
my
right. That's right.
waters." And therefore, the European Union, which is not exactly this bastion of belligerence, and said, "Turkey, you can't do that, and we issue sanctions against you, Turkey, if you don't stop."
Yeah.
So that's another wrinkle,
Well,
which
yeah.
doesn't put the United States and Turkey on a direct collision course, but it puts Europe now
Well,
and Turkey
I
on a
think
collision
the way
course.
we boil this down is very quickly is very simple. Look, Turkey's wanted to get into the EU for ages, and they can't get into the EU. And then Cyprus, the Greek Republic, became a member of the EU. I mean, number one, that is just, so, in a way, disconcerting for Turkey. First of all, it's one island, and the idea that the Turks have proposed is to share the resources. And the Greeks and the Greek Cypriots have been resistant to that idea. And that's problematic. Even in Switzerland, the negotiations, as I heard about those, were very difficult. The Turks suggested a bizonal arrangement. They've come up with a number of ideas. But again, there are many parties involved. The Greek Cypriots, Greece, the guarantors, UK, Turkey. It's a mishmash, but now it's complicated by the alliance between Greece and Israel and these corporations that are doing exploration. And they're saying, Turkey, you don't have a place in here. It's really geopolitical. The answer is solve the problem on the island end the boycott and embargo of the Turkish Cypriots, which is very unfair, and work up a deal and then share the resources for the benefit of all the Cypriots on the island. That is the proper solution, and I think the United States has been encouraging of that solution. So right now we have a kerfuffle and a problem on this issue, and the EU sanctions, to my humble opinion, sanctions are in the air. Maybe they're reading about CAATSA sanctions, they're reading about sanctions, and they think, you know what, maybe we should do some sanctions too. And I think that has no efficacy at all, and it's totally illegitimate and improper to just sanction Turkey when the idea is to have everybody get together and share.
Indeed. Okay, but that shows how complicated this is.
It is.
I would be the first one to applaud once the two communities, the Turkish community
Yes.
in the north and the Greek community in the south, in Cyprus, would could figure out a way to reconstitute the state that used to be there, prior to 1974.
Exactly.
We'll see. We'll see how that evolves. But in the meantime, there is this issue of economic interests which are
That's right.
involved with all these companies. By the way, one way in which America is involved is ExxonMobil is one of the
Of course.
energy companies
Of
that has a
course.
concession
Of course.
in the Greek
Noble Energy.
Cypriot waters. But then there's also the Italians, and then there's the French. I think.
and Total. And
Yes, there are others
Yeah.
involved.
Yeah.
And so how you I wouldn't say adjudicate, because we're not there yet, but at least how you police, how you make sure that nobody gets in each other's
Well,
ways.
look, there's a law of the sea agreement. These blocks there's some blocks that are not contested, some blocks that are contested, a number of the exclusive economic zones overlap. So this is a law of the sea issue, but don't get hung up on that. Let's work up the deal so that the two groups on the island, look, de facto reality, there's a reality check. There's two groups on the island. Why is it that the Turkish Cypriots are embargoed? You can't put a cruise ship there. If you want to go by plane, you have to go to Turkey and then take a plane to Turkish Cyprus. But the Republic of Cyprus is wide open and a member of the EU. That just seems to be kind of not waking up to the reality of what the island looks like today. And it's not going to be reversed. And it's kind of continuously thinking backwards, kind of what you said, the historical and the thing. Let's go back, flash back to the 60s and the 70s and find out all the things that happened, particularly in 74. I don't think that's an efficacious thing to do. Right now we have the situation, we actually have some very valuable resources that could be a win-win for the people on the island if they shared it. So instead of fighting about it, work up a deal and share it. But no, we're not doing that. And you remember the other wrinkle, you talked a lot about wrinkles. The UK is a guarantor. It has 2 bases on the island. And on Turkish Cyprus, there's a large British expatriate community there. It's a lot of the Brits who retired, who used to be working on the island when Cyprus was part of the Commonwealth, was part of the British Empire, I retired there. When I was in Turkish Cyprus, I went down to near the water, and I hear people speaking with British accents. I nearly flipped out. But the fact is, it's a multi-complex issue, but it's not so hard to figure out. They're not fighting. You just said, you're right. They're not fighting right now. They have these negotiations, these complex legal kind of, the Jesuits analyzing the legal principles on the head of a pin, and they can't get a solution. I think they need to get a solution with let's say, the cajoling maybe a little bit by the main powers, so we don't have to be fighting over the resources, but we are sharing the resources for the benefit of the people of the island. That, to me, is a good solution.
Look, I amen to that.
Okay, I accept.
I am certainly completely in agreement. It is a sad thing that after all these various attempts at negotiating a
Yes.
solution between the two communities, at the moment this is still elusive. I hope that they become a little more enthusiastic on both sides. I mean, I'm not choosing.
Look, the communities are not well integrated, and that is a problem. In other words, it is true that Greek Cypriots crossed the line. The line, you can cross right over the line. At some points in history, you couldn't. That was a contentious line. Troops there, you couldn't. People come over to the Republic. They cross over into Turkish Cyprus. People are working back and forth. But the two communities are not integrated and interacting. And that we need to have that interaction on the ground between the two groups. And where you have the problem is the kind of, the connection that the indigenous people there, the Turks to the Turkey and the Greek Cypriots to Greece, and enosis and all these ideas that existed all along about connecting up the island to the mother country, has really gotten in the way of the Cypriots actually interacting with each other and working with each other and having coffee with each other and getting together. And that we need to have that cultural and societal interaction, which has to be part and parcel of the political interaction. You can't just, rub a stamp on top of an island. No, now you're going to be one by zonal country. That's where the hang-up is. And plus the mother country, and I'm going to say particularly Greece, but again, that's just my predilection, has really interfered with the ability of the Greek Cypriots to make their own decisions, because the Greek Cypriots have always wanted to make sure that they were in sync with the mother country and making decisions in sync with the mother country and never giving in to help work it out with the Turks. I think everybody should sit down and work it out. I don't know if it's ever going to happen. I mean, I'm not necessarily pessimistic, but I don't have a lot of room for optimism because people thought with the UN and the US and UK, Greece, Turkey, that the Switzerland negotiations, they worked hard on that. And the UN was pushing, everybody was pushing it, and it didn't happen. That was a very, very big disappointment. So they have to get that back on track. And the reason is because of these resources, this Aphrodite field, there's very valuable resources there, which would be great for the people. It would be a boon for the island. But politics does get in the way.
Well, these are sobering thoughts, and maybe this is a fitting, conclusion to our wide-ranging conversation. We've covered certainly a lot of ground. Mark, we're very thankful for your insights and contributions. This has been our podcast with Mark Meirowitz, Associate Professor at SUNY Maritime College and a Global Policy Institute Fellow. We've talked a great deal about U.S.-Turkey relations, and now in the tail end of our conversation, other aspects which have to do with Cyprus and Turkey and the EU and broader matters of I guess, exclusive economic zones and hydrocarbons and how they could be shared productively for the benefit of the two communities, and probably more, depending on how much stuff there is in the waters of Cyprus. Let me conclude by saying that in the waters of Cyprus, from the water of Cyprus, the goddess Venus, right? Aphrodite in Greek was born. She being the goddess of love. Maybe, who knows, something magical.
I think we need a little Greek mythology.
A little love
out.
that will come and make things a little softer for everybody. But with that, we thank you, Mark, and until next time.
Tremendous pleasure. Thank you, Paolo.